You'll remember that we discussed in the previous episode how Syria was always vulnerable to invasion from the south, and the big pathway to invading Syria was through Lebanon, especially through the Bekaa Valley here, which if you'd enter it, you can then swing east into Syria and occupy Damascus. And you'll remember that we had discussed how Damascus was the keystone city of the Levant, and whoever dominates Damascus, if they have the right technology, can pretty much dominate the entire coast from Gaza all the way to Turkey. So this is really the context in which all of this is taking place. And the Syrians had been backing the jihadis in Iraq. Robert Fisk wrote about it. The Prime Minister of Iraq said as much, and so on and so forth. I won't bore you with all of the list of details or with the details of the assassinations. I'll just mention that this was happening. And so in 2011, when the uprisings in the Middle East kick off, you'll remember that there was one in Libya. The Russians agreed with the Americans to allow the UN to intervene in Libya, and that was used as a pretext to kill Gaddafi and to sort of end his rule there, and Libya has been in chaos since then. And that there was an uprising in Egypt, in Tunisia, there was unrest in Jordan and in Morocco, there was a civil war in Yemen, and then in March 2015, things kick off in Syria. Now, 2 weeks before the uprising in Syria began, or a couple of days actually, before the uprising in Syria began, a gentleman called Abu Muhammad Al-Jolani, now known as Ahmad al-Shara, was released from prison in Iraq. And by August of 2011, he gets sent into Syria. And at that point, there were protests in Syria that had begun calling for the overthrow of the regime from around April onwards. And they had spread to the center of Syria. They started in Dar'a here in the south, and then they spread to Homs, to Hama, to pretty much all over the country. And they were calling for the overthrow of the regime. And there was a lot of violence. The state was shooting some people, but the state was also getting shot at. And it wasn't clear who was responsible for all of the violence. Some of it was obviously the Syrian government. Some of it was not. Actually, there was a point that I wanted to mention earlier, which is that the relationship between Syria and the United States between 2001 and 2003, so I just want to go back in time for 10 years. And what's important to mention here is that the CIA was sending Al-Qaeda members to Syria to get interrogated. And they were getting tortured in Syria. But if you look at the description of the torture, it was mainly beating with pipes, with plastic pipes. And this was the lowest level of torture in Syria. Like if you know anything about Syrian torturers, they were really expert at their craft. They had been trained by the East Germans and by at least one Nazi. And the torture from the East Germans was so severe that Syrian prisoners would go on hunger strike to demand being tortured by Syrians, to not have the German techniques used against them. And some of the more common techniques were pulling out fingernails, electrocution. There's something called the chicken position, where they would sort of tie people's arms and legs together and put them on a spit and turn them and beat them. There was hanging from something called the Balenko. They would just hang you from the ceiling by your wrists for sometimes days on end and barely keep you alive. But for the CIA, they only did beatings. And they asked questions that the CIA had asked them to ask. And that was part of the global war on terror. So after September 11, the Syrian government under Bashar was still very supportive of Hezbollah, but they were still trying to stay on the Americans' good side. And so, as a favor to the Americans, they would allow the CIA to bring prisoners to Syria and torture them on the CIA's behalf. This changed after the 2003 Iraq invasion and after the threats to overthrow the Syrian government. And I wanted to mention that context because I'd previously said that Syria was an enemy of the West. Yes, it was, but not strictly by choice. It was because the West had designated it as an enemy and decided to destroy it, in part because of Syria's support for Hezbollah. The preferred policy for the Syrians from the days of Assad the father was to have some kind of balance between the West and Iran, and to try to play both sides as much as possible to maximize their freedom of action, knowing full well that they could never actually defeat Israel, let alone the rest of the West. But the choice was made for them, and enmity was imposed on them. So I just wanted to add that nuance because somebody asked me about it, and I thought I'd share it with you. Anyway, things kick off properly in Syria in 2011, and by 2012, the Syrians are facing a full-scale insurgency. And Jabhat al-Nusra, what became the Al-Qaeda offshoot of Syria, whose leader is today the president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara, announces itself in 2012, and it says that it's just a group of Muslims that is there to defend the Syrian people against aggression. But between the Jabhat al-Nusra announcement and the start of violence, there had been a couple of other developments. Militant groups had announced themselves in Homs. This is the central province of Syria here. And Homs province extends from the outskirts of the city of Homs all the way to Palmyra, Tadmur. And they placed themselves in this location precisely so that they could cut Damascus from the east of the country and from the north of the country and from the coast in order to bring about a collapse. And some of the first meetings that Ahmed al-Shara, Abu Muhammad Al-Jolani, whatever you want to call him, conducted were in Homs to try to create cells there. The cells in Homs had begun to radicalize a little bit. And you saw that at some point, the leadership of what was called the Al-Faruq brigades began shaving their mustaches and keeping their beards. And this was always a sign of them having committed to Salafi Islam, the branch of Islam that is most hostile to the Shia. And this was another signal that was being sent to the Alawites and to Hezbollah, that we don't want to have any compromises with you. Because when the Syrian uprising began, Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah at the time, offered to mediate and said, I'm happy to meet with the opposition and to send envoys to the opposition and to try to figure out a way to get to a compromise. And part of the response was this shaving of mustaches to say that we are strict Salafis and we will have no compromise with the Shia. Even the name of the military unit, Al-Faruq Brigade, Al-Faruq is another name for Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second caliph in Islam after Muhammad, and one of the most hated figures in Shia Islam, because allegedly he had accidentally caused the miscarriage and death of Fatima, the wife of Ali. And so the name wasn't random. Like the Syrian opposition, from the days when it was being referred to as the Free Syrian Army and being called purely secular and being called a force that is for liberating Syria and democratizing Syria, from the actual beginning, if you knew what you were looking at and ignored what the media was saying, you could understand that what these people were saying was that they were fully committed to Sunni radicalism and hostility to the Shia, and that nomenclature was intended to terrify both Hezbollah and the Alawites. Hezbollah intervened with a mediation to try to say, look, if you're willing to stay aligned with us and are willing to allow us to continue to receive weapons from Iran via Iraq and Syria into Lebanon, we are willing to talk to the Syrian government to try to give you a bigger role in the governance of Syria. And we are willing to help you. This was the message of Hezbollah. And the response was to shave the mustaches, which is something that if you're talking on, I don't know, the BBC or Sky News, they're not going to explain this to you. But if you're Shia in Lebanon, you don't need it explained. You understand that this meant that these guys had committed to a more radical form of Islam, and that these guys have declared themselves to be your enemies, rather than being a secular force as was being presented to the Western public. Now, to be completely fair, because we want to try our best to be completely fair, there was a secular opposition. This secular opposition was the opposition that was engaged in protests. And the protests continued from 2011 until about 2013. Then it became clear that this was an endless civil war and nothing was going to be recovered through peaceful means. But this secular opposition really didn't have much representation. It was able to call for protests, but the actual mobilization came from the mosques, meaning the Muslim Brotherhood fundamentally. And there was an enormous amount of money spent by Saudi Arabia and Qatar and Turkey to try to organize the different strands of the secular opposition alongside the Muslim Brotherhood into some kind of Syrian National Council. They even declared a Syrian National Council that could be presented as a democratic front, that could be presented to Western audiences as the leadership of the opposition. But throughout the war, there was this massive conflict between the leadership of the opposition that was operating out of hotels in Qatar and Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Egypt, and the men doing the fighting on the ground. The men doing the fighting on the ground, some of them were defected Syrian soldiers, but the majority eventually ended up being not that. They ended up being young men who were recruited by the jihadi groups and who were committed to some kind of radical Sunni Islamic rule in Syria. These groups themselves were enormously divided. And so if you were to try to pass between two Syrian regions that were controlled by the opposition, pretty much every town had its own local flavor of a militia. Some of them obeyed bigger national militias like the Islam Army or the Free Syrian Army or whatever, but in reality they were just local groups. And the only group with broad geographic spread was Jabhat al-Nusra. Until 2012, Jabhat al-Nusra kept quiet. In 2012, I think in April, they announced themselves and they announced that they were active in Syria, and they started gaining big support because of their military skill. These guys had trained in Iraq and then used that training to train other groups in Syria. Abu Muhammad Al-Jolani says that he was sent to Syria by Baghdadi, the leader of the Islamic State in Iraq at the time, with $50,000 and 5 men. And he built that into an empire, essentially. So within a year or so, he had 5,000 men under arms. Now he probably has 20, 30,000 men under arms, probably more than that. And these guys were really the most effective strike force. And they acted really as a power amplifier. So they would gather the other smaller jihadi groups, and they would tell them which military positions to attack. And they would lead that charges themselves with forces that they would describe as inghimasiyin. A word for it might be divers or suicide divers. These would be guys who would go to the front line with the objective of dying in combat, but also of taking away as many Syrian soldiers with them as possible. And they really mastered the art of suicide vehicles. Because they didn't have proper artillery, what they used were suicide cars that they would pack with massive amounts of explosives, obviously, and that they would also armor enormously so that they would be impenetrable to most direct fire, except from advanced anti-tank weapons, which were in short supply. And so these guys would organize sieges of Syrian army bases after they had worn them down and gotten them to consume a lot of the equipment that they had. They would then send these suicide units paired with suicide vehicles. They would break down the defenses and allow the other forces to capture Syrian government positions. And they did so quite successfully. So successfully, in fact, that in 2012, Hezbollah saw that its main supply line from Syria was under threat, which was the town of Qusayr here, on the border between Syria and Lebanon. And Hezbollah then decides that it's going to start sending fighters into Syria.
If you enjoyed this piece of premium content from the Lotus Eaters, head to our website where you can find more.